Tilda. Today we're going to be looking at some pretty bad science, and then we're going to look at the media reaction to this bad science. And throughout this entire piece, you're going to notice one very distinct theme, and that is that the authors of this piece of scientific research have clearly started with their conclusion and then just tried to find any way of making their results fit that conclusion, even when there is ample evidence within their own model that suggests otherwise. And that's before we've even commented on how broken their methodology is to start with. So let's get straight on into this, shall we? Race effects on eBay. Abstract. We investigate the impact of seller race in a field experiment involving baseball card auctions on eBay. Photographs showed the cards held by either a dark-skinned African-American hand or a light-skinned Caucasian hand. Cards held by African-American sellers sold for approximately 20% less than cards held by Caucasian sellers, and the race effect was more pronounced in sales of minority player cards. Our evidence of race differentials is important because the online environment is well controlled, and because the results show that race effects can persist in a thick real-world market such as eBay. Well, that all sounds pretty damning and fairly conclusive, doesn't it? But we're going to look through this experiment, and the conclusion that they have drawn here will unravel quite rapidly. Just so we're all clear, this paper is divided into 5 sections. Section 1 sets the stage for our empirical analysis by outlining how, in theory, race-based evaluations of auction items offered by African American versus Caucasian sellers could affect auction outcomes in common value and private value auctions. Section 2 describes the design of our field experiment. While other studies of internet auctions have not examined potential differential treatment by racial appearance, the design of our study nonetheless benefited greatly from the large existing literature on eBay and other internet auctions as described in detail in Section 2. Section 3 presents our empirical results, and Section 4 provides discussion. Section 5 briefly concludes. Section 1 I'm not going to touch because it just talks about how racial bias can be a thing and how other papers have written about it historically. So it's nothing actually relevant to the numbers that we're going to be looking at in this study. Since here I'm only concerning myself with the numbers generated by this study and how they have come to a conclusion that is completely wrong, and the media's reaction to this. So here is the TLDR of how the study was designed. They have 394 eBay auctions selling off baseball cards. Half of them are going to be sold by the dark-skinned African-American account, the other half are going to be sold by the light-skinned Caucasian account. All the cards that they're using are purchased over a 17-day period. The estimated value of all of the cards is between $3 and $8 each. In this particular instance, they're using quite modestly priced cards to ensure that they don't encroach into the area of the market where fraudulent copies are likely to arise. So they're trying to avoid people being suspicious of them. Every single card begins its bidding at 99 cents with no reserve price and all with $1.50 for shipping, and they are only willing to ship to the United States. Each auction lasted 1 week. Anytime a card was sold, they would leave identical feedback, in this instance, great buyer, thanks, on the profiles of the people who bought the cards. And obviously the means by which they differentiate the cards being sold by the African-American account and the Caucasian account is by having photographs of the hand holding each card. So half of the cards are going to be held by a black hand and the other half are going to be held by a white hand. And then they're going to see what the difference is. Now, there's already problems in the methodology, and we're going to look at a few of them, because the very few differences at this early stage of the methodology could quite easily account for all of the differences that you see later on. but we're going to start investigating those now. So just one final foreword about the method of the study here. They actually did this in 2 rounds. They used one white account and one black account, both of which were sort of new accounts, had no seasoning, no feedback, nothing like that on them. And then they performed a second round where they again divided the cards up between black and white, but this time using accounts which were seasoned, so they did actually have feedback that was as equal as they could get it. So when we look at some of the results later, you'll see that there is unseasoned and seasoned, both black and white, just to clear that up so people don't get confused. But this study actually found out that the seasoning seemed to make absolutely no difference. And another final word on this as well, they had obviously to generate user IDs from this, and they did so by basically using a string of numbers and letters, so there would be no identifying features of the ethnicity or anything like that, hopefully, that could impact people outside of just the photograph with the hand and the card. So with all of that out of the way, let's get into all of the problems with the method. Firstly, and most importantly, for anyone who is in any way even remotely interested in the actual scientific method, you will notice there is no control group for this study. Now obviously a control group is something that is designed to give you an unbiased picture of what the scape is before you begin introducing your variables. In this instance, the main variable that they are looking at is the presence of a white hand in the picture versus the presence of a black hand in the picture. In order to understand how much of an impact that makes, you would need to have a baseline which did not feature a hand at all. And this is something which is very conspicuous in its absence in this study. And this is something that they even acknowledge, stating that the photographs used in our sales were unusual, although not unique, in showing the card held by a hand versus simply on its own. Now, I find it very curious that they would intentionally not have a control group in their study, and this is something which happens quite frequently in the social sciences, when in their mind they already have a conclusion that they want to get to, and they need to try and find a way of getting there. The explanation for why they don't have a control group is quite simple. It is the norm on eBay to not feature a hand holding a playing card. These are collectible items, and people who are very picky about collecting certain items, especially things that are made of paper or made of card, these hardcore collectors can be especially picky about how many times cards have been held, how much handling they have been subject to, because the presence of human skin against paper can degrade the quality of the item over time, owing to the acids and salts that are constantly being exuded by your skin. And there is, of course, the concept of basic photographic aesthetics when it comes to auctioning things. In a lot of cases, people simply prefer to not be looking at another person or to not see parts of a person when it's unnecessary when it comes to photographing an object. So in this particular instance, I can't help but think that the reason they have intentionally excluded a control group from this experiment is because they would have found that the control group would have brought in, on average, a higher price for all of its cards than the white group and the black group, thus proving that the presence of a hand would degrade the price, which, if we go by the standards of evidence that they end up using, would be clear proof that eBay hates people. And you'll see why I make that sarcastic, slightly hyperbolic statement a little bit later. The next problem with the methodology, and this is a massive one, I cannot overstate how much this problem basically invalidates all of their results, and that is the way the cards were allocated to the sellers. Cards were allocated to sellers as follows. First, the cards to be sold were put in alphabetical order by player last name. Then the cards were allocated to the 4 sellers on a rotating basis. Aaron to seller Brown, Adams to seller McDowell, Bulker to seller Bruton, Charles to seller Ayres, and then back to Brown. So they've lined all the cards up and just flung them out, going one to everyone in a rotating system. I'm sure we can all see the problem here. The problem here is that all of your people are not selling the same products. You already admitted earlier that there is a variable between $3 to $8 of the value of the cards that you're selling. If you are dishing them out between 4 people, it is quite possible that one of those people could end up with all of the cards valued at $8, and another person could end up with all of the cards valued at $3. This is a factor that has not been controlled for, and even in their own experiment, they state that to avoid having our experiment be obtrusive, we intentionally did not have the same card being offered by sellers of both races. They claim that the reason that they are doing this is to stop people on eBay noticing that 2 identical cards or near-identical cards are being sold using 2 near-identical photographs with the only variable being the color of the hand. Because if someone notices that, then they might be aware that an experiment is being run and that could compromise the integrity of it. Now, obviously, if you have test subjects and they realize that they're part of an experiment, yes, that can be a very distinct problem. However, what this has done is given you an unequal or a potentially unequal starting point, whereby the resources being allocated to each people might not be equal. This factor is bound to have a knock-on effect later down the line, which you are not adjusting for. So we have no control group and we have unequal input of resources. And you are expecting in some way for any conclusion from this to be valid in any capacity whatsoever. No. Just no. But we're going to move on to some of the empirical results, and once again, we're going to see how they intentionally ignore some parts of their data in order to fit their predetermined conclusion. So heading down to the empirical results section, you're going to start seeing some data points which calls into question their own conclusion. Keep in mind that their conclusion, as per the abstract, is that race certainly is a factor when you are operating online if you are black. So when we get to this part, 370 of the 394 cards were sold, which represents 94% of the total. 24 of the cards did not attract any bids. 11 of those were held by the African American hand, while 13 of them were held by the Caucasian hand. In addition, 36 cards, while successfully auctioned, were never paid for by the winning bidder. These cards too were almost evenly distributed, 16 of them held by the African American hand and 20 by the Caucasian hand. Now that is really rather interesting, isn't it? If you want to come to the conclusion that eBay is racist and that race is a problem when it comes to operating on eBay, I find it very unusual that the black hand has sold a higher quantity of material than the white hand, and that the white hand has experienced more no-shows when it comes to paying than the black hand. And this is very interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, it calls into question whether race actually is a problem. But second of all, it makes for another interesting point. You noticed earlier that the average that the black hand sold for was only 90-something% of that of the white hand. So what this means is that while the black hand has sold more, it has clearly had to sell at a lower price in order for that 90-something% gap to still exist. Now, if you had a preconceived conclusion that race is a problematic issue on eBay, you would no doubt look at that and instantly declare racism. However, we now come back to the largest problem with the methodology, and that is the unequal method by which the resources were allocated, because of the round-robin approach to dishing out the cards amongst the 4 users. So because of that factor, anything to do with price can basically be explained away, potentially, by the resource management and allocation of this study, rather than having to jump to the conclusion of racism. But since this study is attempting to prove racism, I just find it very interesting that in both of these examples, the white hand fared worse than the black hand when it came to overall units moved. So the next part of the empirical results begins talking about some of the plotted graphs which came up as a result of their findings, and we're going to look at that now. This is a chart which plots out the sale prices of each of the individual cards and where it ended along the auction timescale. And this is where you begin to notice the problem which I pointed out earlier with the methodology, where you ensure that the things being sold are not the same between all of your subjects. What you will notice here is that, quite simply, the black hand that was selling has a far wider scope of cards. They not only simultaneously sell the highest value cards, but they also sell the lowest value cards as well. And this is why the fitted values lines has been so very important for them to add, because that is the line that allows them to say that black people will earn 90% of what a white person earns. Which, as you can see by looking at this graph, is actually a bullshit conclusion, and the reason that it is a frankly bullshit conclusion is, as you can see by looking at the extremes of either end, some products will simply sell for more than others. This is a factor which could have been controlled for by ensuring that both the black and the white sold the same cards, but you didn't. Because that factor was not accounted for, the conclusion based on this data is irrelevant. Because of the round-robin approach by which they divvied out this uneven resource of using the white-black method when handing them out, if they had simply swapped those around and gone black-white, this pattern could quite easily be reversed, because it's the actual product that has determined what it sells for and not the colour of the hand holding it. If all of this nonsense wasn't enough to put several nails in the coffin of this study, I'd also like to note some other things about the empirical data that these people claim is of relevance. They attempt to state here that Table 2 shows that cards sold by the African American hand both sold for less and were purchased for more, and that this will somehow indicate racism on eBay because black people have to spend more. But once again, we come back to the original problem. They are not buying the same thing. Also, given the random method by which they assigned the screen name and email address to this account, it would be impossible for other people on eBay to be able to discern whether or not the account that was buying these cards was owned and operated by a white person or a black person. So if that factor is controlled for and intentionally hidden, then you cannot claim that there is any sort of intentional correlation between the buying price and the race of the account doing the buying. You can simply state that this was a coincidental thing, because after all, if that account was operated by a white person, the prices would still be the same, and the fact that that person was white would still be unknown. At this point in time, it's almost as if they're just disregarding parts of their own method to suit their narrative. So at this point in time, it's pretty safe to say that anyone who takes this paper even remotely seriously, suggesting that it can in any way conclude anything other than sometimes different things cost different amounts, is a scientifically illiterate moron. Which is naturally why the Washington Post proudly proclaims whites earn more than blacks, even on eBay. And why Fusion.net will follow this up with researchers found whites will earn 20% more than blacks on eBay. both of them citing this pathetic, piss-poor excuse for a piece of research. And it is blatantly obvious that none of the authors who are talking about this have even read it. As the Washington Post will say, this paper is unique according to the researchers because it's able to zero in on the effects of race specifically. Unlike some previous studies on this kind of discrimination, this one was more closely controlled in a way that the researcher says will eliminate other sources of bias, such as economic class. Well, clearly the Washington Post has no idea what a control is. No, unfortunately, this type of study is the sort of pseudoscientific bullshit that we are increasingly seeing coming out of the social so-called sciences. It is absolute junk science, where it is quite abundantly clear that the people performing the research already have a rough idea of what they want their conclusion to be, and will simply attempt to find any way to get what they're doing to produce those desired results. In this instance, to prove that eBay is racist and hates black people. And they will do this by totally disregarding the basic scientific concept of having a control group by repeatedly saying, "We only care about the difference between whites and blacks," and then providing their white subject and black subject with unequal resources with which to conduct the experiment. This research is garbage, the people who carried it out are morons, and anyone who thinks that this research in any way proves its own conclusion is probably suffering from a condition that I like to call terminal stupidity.